Well, hi everyone, and welcome to Infinite Flight's first ever webinar and something we're calling the Infinite Flight Briefing Room. Briefing Room will be webinar episodes grouped into series and cover a wide range of Infinite Flight topics to help you be a better pilot or air traffic controller. Infinite Flight is a flight simulator for iOS and Android devices, featuring global flight with 15 meter per pixel satellite terrain imagery, multiplayer, ATC, and more. With a diverse fleet of aircraft and worldwide instrument procedures, our team is always pushing toward making Infinite Flight the best mobile simulator for pilots and enthusiasts. Today, Briefing Room will be starting out by covering Infinite Flight basics, as well as some common mistakes new users might make when starting out. Future episodes will dig much deeper into advanced functions such as pilot decision making during an unstable approach, flying instrument procedures, planning ahead for controlling busy airspaces, and more. So before we get going, let's cover some housekeeping items. We'll try to answer some questions at various points in the presentation. It's a good idea to keep the question link open in your browser as we go in case you have a question while the presentation is happening. You can also visit infiniteflight.com/questions to get there easily. Now, on previous live streams that our team has done, we've tried to answer a wide variety of user questions relating to Infinite Flight. However, in these webinars, we ask that you keep questions relevant to the topics that we're discussing, if possible. These webinars are for informational purposes, so if you require technical support with Infinite Flight, please visit our community forum at community.infiniteflight.com. For individual support, open a help ticket by emailing support@infiniteflight.com. The webinars will remain on our YouTube channel and be added to a webinar playlist for easy viewing later. If you're not watching this webinar live, keep in mind that episodes will not be updated as new features come to Infinite Flight. It's important to always check our official guide for up-to-date information if you're unsure. And of course, any ATC or pilot advice is to be applied to Infinite Flight use only. Very important to always consult a certified flight instructor before applying anything you have learned in these episodes in the real world. For more learning resources, make sure you visit our official user guide at infiniteflight.com/guide. And you can follow us on social media and YouTube at Infinite Flight. So here are some of the topics that we'll cover in this episode: where to find help and support, Infinite Flight grade table and violation history, some ATC tips for pilots, crosswind takeoff and landings, and we'll recap some learning resources at the end for you. Okay, so our presenters today are all part of the non-development side of the Infinite Flight team. I'll start out by introducing myself. I'm Jason Rosewell, and I handle our digital marketing in addition to providing admin and business development support. I'm a student pilot at my local field where I live on Georgian Bay, north of Toronto, Canada. Next, we have Tyler Shelton. Tyler is our ATC community manager and organizes our Infinite Flight ATC, or as we call it, IFATC team. Tyler also is responsible for our pilot and ATC YouTube tutorials and developed and maintained our IFATC instruction manual. He has a wealth of real-world ATC knowledge as a retired United States Air Force controller who now serves as a controller in the FAA. Last but not least on this episode is Regan Hawthorne. Regan is Infinite Flight's technical writer and is responsible for our online documentation as well as maintaining the IFATC manual with Tyler. Regan lives in England and is a first officer for a major UK airline, type rated on the A320 series. He started flying at the age of 15, went on to become a gliding instructor, completed his professional training, and now flies short and medium haul across Europe, Northern Africa, and the Middle East. Okay, let's get started. If you're new to Infinite Flight, I'd like to first point you to some resources that will be available to you as you start out. If you're a textbook learner, our official user guide is the place to start. Regan has put together a lot of material in our ever-expanding user manual, which you can visit at infiniteflight.com/guide. The Getting Started section is then broken down further into topics like installing the app, home user interface, pilot user interface, and ATC interface. An important thing to note about this presentation and the user guide is that some Infinite Flight features like global flight, multiplayer with ATC, and access to all aircraft will require a subscription to Infinite Flight Pro. Simply accessing the Fly Online screen will prompt you to subscribe if you haven't already. For help with that and for some other frequently asked questions, you can visit the Get Help section of our user guide. Some questions that our support team field often are related to user grades. So Infinite Flight uses a grading system to determine who has access to our various multiplayer online servers, which range from casual to expert. To access your grade information, first, tap your display name from the top right corner of the screen. Next, tap the information icon next to where your grade is displayed. Your grade will now be displayed in the first column, and in the next column, you will see what is required to achieve your next grade. Many factors go into determining your grade, violations being one, which we won't cover in this webinar. But for an in-depth look at user grades and violations, you can visit our blog at infiniteflight.com/blog and check out the article called Infinite Flight's New Grade Requirements. Now, if we look at the bottom of the grade table, we'll find an option to show violation history. Violations will be displayed along with time and date and a description of the violation. Time and date can be useful in finding the appropriate replay file if you're interested in investigating the cause of a previous violation. Okay, so now I'll turn it over to Tyler, who's going to take us through some things that can make your experience interacting with ATC better. We'll go more in depth into these topics in future webinar episodes. So Tyler, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jason. Again, my name's Tyler. I'm going to be talking about the check-in function of ATC. It's commonly misunderstood, but I'm going to help you understand a few scenarios where you're likely going to encounter it. Whether you're departing or arriving in, checking in with one of Infinite Flight's radar facilities is something that you're going to do often. Before we look at a few scenarios, let's just look at how we can find that command on your ATC comms menu. When you're tuned into a radar facility, whether departure, center, approach, you can open up your ATC communication menu by tapping the headset icon in the bottom left, select check-in, and this alerts ATC that you're tuned in and wish to continue following your flight plan. The response radar contact from ATC establishes that two-way communication acknowledgement of your position, and it's the approval to continue following your flight plan, so you don't need to separately request flight following. With extremely busy airspaces on Infinite Flight, this short pilot ATC interaction can help keep the frequencies clear, and then the traffic is moving quickly from point A to point B. So what situations would this be best used in? Let's just start with the departure scenario and your first interactions with departure control and center as you climb to cruise. So whether you filed a SID or your own series of waypoints, your first transmission to continue following this flight plan is a check-in. Departure's response radar contact allows you to follow your flight plan, the SID, and climb to your initial cruising altitude without a specific altitude request. So you can go all the way up to whatever desired cruising altitude you initially had in mind. When departure control hands you off to center while climbing, you again only need to check in. Once you're level at cruise, you must request any additional altitude changes if you're in active airspace. The arrival phase with center shares many similarities, though these check-in procedures don't apply to approach control, which we'll get into in a moment. As you approach your destination and tune into center, your first transmission again will be a check-in, assuming the destination is fully staffed with tower and an approach controller. The response radar contact allows you to continue following your flight plan to include a filed star. However, a specific request to descend via that star must be made and should be done about 1 minute prior to your top of descent. If your destination does not have approach available, you can simply make your approach request on initial contact with the center serving your destination airport. At any time on your arrival, center may ask you to say your approach request. If you're flying to an airport that's not currently staffed with an approach controller, this just means that they want you to call inbound with your position and requested approach at your destination so they know what service to give you. The approach request is a great segue into what you should do when you're handed off to approach control or if you're tuning into approach for the first time. The first transmission with approach control should always be your approach request, whether it's the ILS, visual, or GPS, now to check in with approach control. The response continue as filed, expect the ILS, GPS, visual, etc., allows you to continue following your flight plan both laterally and vertically if you were already approved to descend with center, or if you'd begun the descent via the star on your own. The response expect vectors for means that you should expect to be given ATC assigned headings and altitudes to your destination. The rest of your flight plan from here should be pretty familiar, but if you haven't already, be sure you check out our descent video tutorial that takes you step by step through the descent process with ATC. Okay, so we talked about how to check in with ATC and we've gotten permission to continue as filed, but you're probably wondering, okay, are they going to ever take me off of my filed route? Absolutely. Much like the real world, traffic volume, immediate conflicts, and even terrain can dictate whether or not ATC jumps in to assign a heading or an altitude. This is going to come without warning, but does require immediate action. So while flying with LNAV and VNAV armed, you can quickly tap each of them on your autopilot panel. That's going to disengage the lateral and vertical function of autopilot. You can input the assignment given by ATC, and now you've been able to exit your flight plan and comply with those ATC instructions. During peak traffic periods at your destination airport, you may be met with immediate instructions upon checking in that differ from what was filed or even the preferred star that may be advertised. This is happening so center or approach control can set the arrival sequence and begin establishing spacing and deconflicting converging stars. In some cases, you may be told to continue as filed, which means you can navigate back to the most appropriate leg based on your current position, though most times you can expect to just be vectored manually all the way to your destination and for the desired approach. So while departure from your flight plan can come without warning, a really good way to anticipate this is just staying ahead of the aircraft. Constantly scanning your surroundings for conflicts and adjust your speed or course accordingly. Take a look at your destination's airspace and try to think about your arrival from a controller's perspective. This can kind of help you make some subtle adjustments that help maintain your spacing or just proactively develop a plan for when you're inevitably taken off of that filed route. So really just put yourself in that controller mindset and think, okay, what are they going to do next? And that helps it just not be such a surprise. So we've talked about how to check in, we've applied it to all phases of flight, and we've gone over how to exit our flight plan when ATC issues alternate instructions. But before we dive into a few pilot topics with Regan, submit any questions that you may have, and I'd be happy to answer.
Okay, thanks, Tyler. We do have some questions here. So one I have that I'm going to put on the screen. Okay, sorry, folks. Technical difficulties are always a possibility during a first try at something. So Tyler, if you're still there with me, we have one from eCoops. I'm just going to read it. When a new pilot comes on to the servers at Infinite Flight, what can they expect? And what are the basics when entering an online session? So for etiquette, Unicom, etc.
Yeah, it's a pretty loaded question, but the first thing that I always recommend to anybody that's entering for the first time is to just take it slow. A lot of times when we look at violation appeals or even just kind of fielding questions after somebody's had their first maybe expert server session, is when we look back at the things that they made mistakes on, it was because they were just really rushing. So I think sometimes being really collected and deliberate about what you're doing. So you spawn in, really take some time to kind of scan the airspace, see what the flow of traffic looks like, how are other people departing, like what's the common route that everybody's taking to get to the runway, what runways am I going to have to cross to get to where everybody's departing. I think a lot of those really deliberate steps that you're taking mentally just before you ever even push back from the gate can really set you up for success, so that you're not doing things on the fly. Because anybody in the aviation industry knows that sometimes in the exact moment, it can be really hard to perform and comply with those immediate instructions versus taking the time to do all that planning on the front end.
Right. Okay. So Anonymous has asked, can I use check-in when controlling an approach controller from far away, or contacting an approach controller from far away, when I just want them to know that I'm here, but I don't have an actual request yet?
Yeah, that's fine. In that case, it's okay to just kind of announce your presence on frequency if you don't really have a game plan together just yet. But keep in mind, there are some other options that could be more appropriate. So if you're just flying within the airspace VFR, you can request to just fly VFR within the airspace. And that kind of lets the approach controller know that the ownership is now on you to see and avoid, and that you're just simply navigating on your own. And we do have some other options in terms of just simply getting a flight following to an airport, specifically radar vectors, and then obviously an approach request at any destination within their airspace. So if you truly just don't have any intentions just yet, a check-in is a great way to let them know that, hey, I've tuned in and you now know where I am. But otherwise, consider using some of those other options.
Okay. Great. I'm just scanning the list here to see if we have any other ones. Tyler, I might come back to you as we have questions keep coming in.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, so just a reminder, folks, that you can ask questions by going to the link on the screen or infiniteflight.com/questions. Just keep that open in your browser in case you'd like to see something, and we'll try our best to keep scanning as we go. So now we'd like to switch gears just a little bit here and give you a sample of the types of flying tips that you can expect in future episodes. We're fortunate to have Regan on board with us, who has a huge amount of real world and infinite flight flying experience. So we'll hand it over to Regan now for some Crosswind discussion.
Thanks, Jason. Hi, everyone. And again, my name is Regan. And as Jason mentioned, I'll be covering just a small snippet today on crosswinds to give you an idea of what is to come in other episodes. The techniques used to handle crosswinds during takeoff and landing can vary based on the aircraft that you are flying. For this reason, I'll be focusing on the most common technique used while flying commercial jets, but we'll make sure to cover other techniques in the future. Before we get going, you'll first need to know what the runway direction is and where the wind is coming from. You can use the ATIS to help you if ATC is present, or tap close to the airport from your map or mini-map, select the airport, and then look at the weather tab where you'll find the latest wind direction and strength. So if you're about to take off or land on runway 27 left, and the wind is coming from the right at 300 degrees, you have a crosswind that is 30 degrees offset from the runway heading. Depending on how offset the wind is, will determine how much the wind is a crosswind component. You can see from the table on the side that 15 degrees offset is 25% of the wind strength, 30 degrees is 50%, 45 degrees is 75%, and finally 60 degrees or more is all of the wind strength. We said the wind was 30 degrees offset today, so that means that half the wind strength is our crosswind component. The wind is 40 knots, so that means we have a crosswind component of 20 knots. Now that we have that, we are ready to get going. As you begin to accelerate down the runway for takeoff, you'll need to use your rudder to help maintain the runway centerline. The aircraft will try to turn into wind as the aircraft speed increases, known as weathercocking. So if the wind is coming from the right, the aircraft nose will try to turn to the right. In this case, applying left rudder will keep the nose straight. At your rotation speed, you can rotate as normal and gradually reduce any remaining inputs in your rudder. The aircraft will naturally turn slightly into wind, and you can adjust this heading to maintain the extended centerline of the runway or to follow your desired flight path. For landing, commercial jet aircraft normally adopt the crab method. which is essentially the reverse of the crosswind takeoff technique we've just discussed. To start, we need to aim the nose into wind so that the aircraft can track the extended centerline of the runway. So if the wind is coming from your right, you will need to point the aircraft nose to the right of the runway. How much required will just be a function of how strong the winds are, but a great way to know is by using the flight path vector, also known as the bird. The bird is the green circle that is displayed on your attitude indicator on the HUD screen and shows the flight path of the aircraft. Putting this green circle in the center of the runway will put the aircraft in the same place. Continue to maintain the offset heading until after the flare and just before touchdown. At that point, gently use the rudder to align the aircraft nose with the runway centerline. In strong crosswinds, however, you may need to simultaneously lower the into-wind wing to maintain the centerline until touchdown. So if the wind is coming from your right, tilt your device very slightly to the right. After touchdown, the work doesn't stop. Continue to use the rudder to maintain the runway centerline until you've slowed to a controlled speed where it is no longer required. And that's everything from me for the moment, so back to you, Jason.
All right, thanks, Regan. Now, as a reminder to everyone, if you're an infinite flight controller or pilot, we have lots of resources to help you in your journey. You can visit youtube.com/infiniteflight for video tutorials, and don't forget to subscribe while you're there. Visit infiniteflight.com/guide for our official user guide. Visit community.infiniteflight.com to meet and chat with other Infinite Flight users, as well as get involved in all the VAs and VOs and events, and to see community contributed tutorials as well. And as always, follow us on social media at Infinite Flight. So I think what we'll do is we'll go back to our Q&A, and Tyler and Regan, I'll let you decide who's going to answer these, but we have a couple of good ones here. One anonymous question is, what is the proper way to call inbound for landing? Do I announce inbound or do I announce the approach that I'm flying? So for example, inbound on the ILS, RNAV, visual, etc.
Yep, I'll take that one. So if you're flying inbound, there's basically two different scenarios here. If it's a tower-only facility, meaning you weren't handed off from approach, go ahead and call inbound without the ILS, without the GPS, etc. Simply just call inbound with your position, because what's going to happen is the tower is simply going to assign you essentially a leg of the pattern, whether you're getting a left base entry, a downwind entry, a straight in, etc. If you were handed off from approach, however, like let's say approach set you up for the ILS runway 25 left at Los Angeles. Well, you're going to call in to Los Angeles Tower inbound on the ILS. And what that does is it's kind of just a verification process so that the tower controller knows that you are actually fully established on the ILS and that you were given that service from approach. So again, if approach or a radar facility provides that ILS visual or GPS service, call inbound on that. If you're only calling into a tower only facility, simply call inbound for landing.
Great. And another one that's sort of related to that is what request, just specifically, what request should I use when center hands me off directly to tower without an approach clearance?
Yep. So that's going to be basically the same thing. So I'm assuming in this scenario that center simply allowed you to send via the star, but didn't actually provide any sort of approach clearance, whether it was the ILS, GPS, or visual. So in that case, again, you're just going to just call inbound. The only time you want to tag it with that specific ILS, GPS, or visual is if you were specifically cleared for that by a radar facility.
Okay. Now this question's from Chris, and it's a pilot question, but Tyler, you have already done, I believe, a YouTube tutorial video on this, so this question can be for both of you. Crosswind takeoffs in the X cover very difficult. Is there anything I can do to make it easier? The plane is always drifting to the left or right.
I'll take a quick stab, only because I did a lot of practice on this, especially when it came out. And our developer and CEO, Laura, can tell you that just flying a tail wheel in general is very different. And you have to be extremely proactive and you have to stay on those rudders. But for me, what helped is just really internalizing what the aircraft was going to do before it did it. So I knew that on the takeoffs, it was going to begin yawing one way or another. And that led to my rudder inputs being a lot more proactive, so that before it ever even veered left or right, I already had the correct inputs to counter that.
Okay. Regan, this one's for you. What planning should I do before takeoff in order to be realistic with ATC?
Just planning in general, or?
Yeah, I'm assuming this is like what should we do at the gate before we even start our flight?
Okay, yeah. I think the first thing is just looking at, I mean, it depends also if there's radar is open or not. But I'd just sit on the gate, maybe set up all your lights and things like that, how you want it, your weight and balance, your fuel, your flight plan. But then rather than requesting pushback straight away, just take a couple of minutes and look at where the traffic is on the ground, where are people being sent by the ground controller. If it's quite busy, if there's a lot of people requesting pushback in the same cul-de-sac as you, maybe wait a few more minutes. It's probably more pilot courtesy than anything. And then just like I spoke about with the takeoff crosswind technique, have a look at the weather and try and think ahead where the wind's coming from and how that's going to affect things like your takeoff. As Tyler mentioned with the tail dragger, it's the same for any airline as well. Always trying to stay ahead of the game and thinking about how the wind's going to affect you, how other traffic is going to affect you. You know, if there's someone on final that's on a very short final, is there any point in requesting ready for departure or asking to go when you're not going to get clearance yet to go? Possibly not. So I'd just say, and also this actually kind of touches on about the violations and appeals we talked about earlier. Just try and take it slow. There's really no rush at all, and there's no need to be speeding along at 35 knots, whatever the maximum is that you're allowed to taxi at. Just take your time with everything, I'd say.
Great. Here's a question that came in from a user named Philippe. What do I do if approach leaves while I'm being vectored? And Tyler, this is probably a good one for you.
Yeah, so if approach leaves, now we actually have the benefit of the stars. So you can kind of rely on those instrument procedures a little bit to help maintain the order. But in the absence of ATC, it's always going to default to that Unicom scenario where things really need to slow down even more. Don't get into a kind of a back and forth battle with, okay, who's going to give way to me? Who's going to give way? I'm going to try to speed up and get in there first. I think everybody really just needs to be a little bit courteous. This may result in a bit of a delay, but try to find your way into a line that makes sense, that doesn't inconvenience anyone, but that also doesn't result in kind of a race to the first one to get to the end of the ILS cone, if that makes sense. So once approach leaves, try to look ahead. And this is a big one that I talk to a lot of people about. Try to look ahead and see what approach set up before they left. A lot of times the sequence and the line and everything else is already there. So if everybody just maintains the same speed, the same path, and the same, I guess, kind of plan that approach initiated, you could likely get in without any issues.
Great. Thanks, Tyler. Maybe we'll take one more on the pilot side. And again, I think we do have a YouTube tutorial that covers airliner flying, but specifically on approach, Regan, in an airliner. Are there any tips about flap settings that we should know about, such as max speed for certain flap setting? And obviously this changes based on airplane, but this is just a general question from Cheetah Gaming YT.
Yeah, no problem at all. I'd say obviously the different flap settings vary based on the different aircraft types and also on the weight of the aircraft. So even in a light 320, for example, you could fly 180 knots with flaps 1, and then other days you might be quite heavy and have to take flaps 2 before you can fly 180 knots. So it's quite difficult to fly that as accurately as possible or as realistically as possible at the moment. All I would say is the most common approach speeds, they do vary a little bit based on what airport you're flying into, but I can say 9 times out of 10, by the time you're with approach, you're normally flying at about 220 knots roughly, unless you're a heavy aircraft, and then they'll say minimum clean speed, which might be, say, 230 knots, depending on what aircraft you're in. That's normally what you maintain for a lot of the vectoring. And then usually on base, sometimes on downwind, if they're very busy, you might be slowed to about 180 knots. And you'll normally maintain 180 knots all the way to the intercept of the instrument approach that you're flying that day. And then they normally reduce you to about 160 knots. And then you maintain that until about 4 miles, where you then reduce to your final approach speed and drop the gear and final stages of flap. So all I would suggest is you'll have to look at various pilot operating handbooks or look on the community forum. There's loads of useful tips there, especially in the tutorials category, that have different speeds for different flap settings for different aircraft. But I'd say if you aim for about 220 knots by the time you're with approach, 180 knots on base, and then 160 knots on final until you get to about 4 miles, then that will put you in pretty good stead to be flying like the airlines do.
Perfect. Either of you want to add anything to any of those comments or questions before we wrap up today?
Yeah, I'll add an ATC aspect to the question that Regan just answered. Just for all of our controllers out there, that's something really good to keep in mind. When I was talking about exiting your flight plane, I talked about thinking from the controller's perspective, but a lot of times controllers can also think from the pilot perspective too. And I'm sure Regan can agree with this. It can be very uncomfortable to fly an aircraft at a very slow speed far from the field. So if aircraft are 34 40 miles away, it's pretty uncomfortable to be at 180 knots or really dragging down on the aircraft. So this is kind of a note for our controllers to really expedite the flow, keep those speeds up, keep them consistent with one another so that you have a nice flowing sequence without traffic that's slowed down to a final approach speed 30, 40 miles from the field.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what Tyler said there. And actually, slowing someone down from 250 knots to 220 knots 10, 15 miles earlier makes a much bigger difference and means that the pilot is not having to fly at a quite uncomfortable speed far out, rather than slowing them to 180 knots because you didn't think as far ahead as you could have done with other aircraft around.
Right. So it's not that all or nothing. It doesn't have to be from 250 to final approach. Sometimes that 20 knots can make all the difference to really fit in all your traffic and have a nice sequence.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Well, thanks, guys. And thank you all for joining us for our first Hotspot webinar episode. Thanks for bearing with us through some technical difficulties there and some growing pains. We will be building on this library, which we hope you find useful. You can visit infiniteflight.com/webinars, where there will be other episodes as we go along. Until next time, blue skies and tailwinds from all of us at Infinite Flight.